a figure so dangerous that the world's most powerful intelligence agency deployed its entire arsenal just to erase him from existence, whose very identity was meant to be permanently buried in an unmarked grave, becomes the subject of a decades-long, hyper-secret asset hunt by a foreign government. This was not merely an operation to recover fallen remains. It was the final, unspoken pact between two of history's most volatile revolutionaries who had once sworn to redraw the global map. Mainstream history tells us that Fidel Castro and Che Guevara shared a seamless brotherhood that brought down a brutal dictatorship. But a darker, carefully omitted truth exists beneath that glossy narrative. What really happened in those tense, quiet rooms when Che Guevara suddenly vanished from Cuba in 1965? Was it truly an unquenchable thirst to ignite revolutions across the globe? Or was he quietly pushed out, sacrificed on the altar of cold, hard geopolitical survival? The deeper you dig into this alliance, the more unsettling the answers become. To understand the cracks in the foundation, we must look back to a rainy night in Mexico City in 1955, inside a cramped, dimly lit apartment where two completely different exiles met for the first time. Fidel Castro, a fiercely charismatic Cuban lawyer running from a failed rebellion, was introduced to a nomadic Argentine doctor named Ernesto Guevara. They spent the next 12 hours locked in a frantic, unyielding debate about imperialism, poverty, and the bleeding wounds of Latin America. By sunrise, Che had found his commander, and Fidel had found his ultimate weapon, an uncompromising idealist willing to walk straight into a meat grinder for the cause. Yet, a fundamental contradiction loomed over them from day one. Can a calculating, pragmatic politician and a fanatical, purist guerrilla ever truly share absolute power without one eventually destroying the other? The plan they forged in Mexico was nothing short of suicidal. They intended to overthrow Fulgencio Batista, a ruthless dictator backed to the hilt by Washington's military might. In late 1956, 82 men squeezed onto a leaking, dilapidated yacht named the Granma, sailing straight into a storm toward the Cuban coast. Disaster struck the moment their boots hit the mud. Ambushed by government troops, the rebel force was systematically decimated within hours. Only a handful of bleeding, starved survivors managed to escape into the jagged, unforgiving wilderness of the Sierra Maestra mountains. This is where the myth was born, but the reality was far more brutal. Isolated, heavily outgunned, and facing certain death, Fidel and Che did not surrender. Instead, they began inventing a savage template for modern guerrilla warfare that would leave global military strategists utterly bewildered. Deep in the humid canopy of the Sierra Maestra, Che Guevara underwent a terrifying transformation, shedding his identity as a healer to become an uncompromising military executioner. As a commander, his discipline was absolute, enforcing loyalty with a cold, lethal finality that terrified his own men. Yet this terrifying focus was exactly what the rebel army needed as they began pushing the regime's forces backward. The ultimate test came in December 1958 at the provincial capital of Santa Clara. Batista had dispatched a heavily fortified, armored military train packed with hundreds of elite soldiers and a massive arsenal to crush the rebellion once and for all. Knowing this train was the dictator's last lifeline, Che orchestrated a breathtaking, tactical gamble. Using a single borrowed bulldozer, his small unit derailed the tracks, trapped the armored behemoth, and forced the entire garrison to surrender. Within days, Batista fled the island in panic, and the two young rebels marched into Havana as the undisputed masters of Cuba. The revolution had won, but victory instantly birthed a new, far more insidious crisis. While Fidel navigated the delicate, treacherous waters of statecraft, Che was appointed to oversee the national economy and the revolutionary tribunals, where he signed off on hundreds of executions of former regime officials. But the thrill of governance quickly faded for Che. He was a man built for the trenches, not a mahogany desk. As Cuba grew increasingly dependent on the Soviet Union for economic survival, a pragmatic compromise Fidel felt forced to make. Che began publicly attacking Moscow for its bureaucratic betrayal of true communism. This created a massive, unsustainable diplomatic nightmare for Castro. Fidel was trying to stabilize a fragile nation on the brink of U.S. invasion, while his closest brother-in-arms was turning into an uncontrollable geopolitical liability. Then, in the spring of 1965, the unthinkable happened. Che Guevara completely vanished from the public eye without a trace. Rumors exploded across the globe, with foreign intelligence suggesting that Fidel had secretly executed his radical friend to appease his Soviet backers. To quell the mounting panic, Castro took to national television and read a dramatic farewell letter allegedly written by Che, stating he was renouncing his honorary Cuban citizenship to fight imperialism in new lands. But was this letter an act of pure free will, or a carefully staged exit strategy designed to mask a bitter, ideological divorce? The truth was that Che had slipped into the shadows, first executing a disastrous covert campaign in the Congo before arriving in the dense, hostile jungles of Bolivia. This time, however, the magic of the Sierra Maestra was completely gone. The local peasantry viewed the foreign guerrilla with deep suspicion, and worse, the American Central Intelligence Agency had now locked onto his coordinates, determined to ensure that this Latin American infection would never spread. By October 1967, the walls had completely closed in on Che Guevara in the desolate ravine of Uro. Starving, suffering from severe asthma, and abandoned by his supply lines, Che's small, exhausted band of fighters was encircled by U.S.-trained Bolivian Rangers. Following a brief, violent firefight, a wounded Che was captured and dragged to a dilapidated mud schoolhouse in the tiny village of La Higuera. On October 9th, the execution order came directly from the highest echelons of the Bolivian government, heavily monitored by CYA operatives on the ground. Che was shot multiple times, his body displayed to international journalists to prove the revolutionary icon was dead. But the terror he inspired did not end with his final breath. Fearing that his grave would become a holy shrine for global rebellion, the military cut off his hands for fingerprint verification, loaded his corpse onto a truck in the dead of night, and buried him in a completely secret, unmarked location beneath a dirt airstrip. The world assumed Che Guevara's story was permanently over, but back in Havana, a grieving Fidel Castro was quietly launching the longest, most obsessive intelligence operation in Cuban history. Fidel publicly vowed that his brother's remains would return home, setting off a 30-year shadow hunt that spanned continents. For decades, Cuban spies, geologists, and forensic experts operated under deep cover in Bolivia, meticulously combing through redacted military logs, tracking down aging, retired generals, and searching for any psychological crack in the official wall of silence. It was a maddening, seemingly impossible quest against time and decay. Finally, in late 1997, 3 decades after the execution, a team of researchers unearthed a mass grave near the Valagrande airstrip. Inside, beneath layers of red dirt, lay a skeleton completely missing its hands. DNA analysis confirmed the impossible. The ghost of Che Guevara had finally been found. When the remains were repatriated to Cuba in 1997, Fidel Castro stood on the tarmac, staring down at the small casket of the man who had helped him redefine the 20th century. Che was laid to rest with massive military honors in Santa Clara, beneath a towering bronze monument erected on the very ground of his greatest tactical triumph. Fidel had kept his promise, providing a grand, cinematic ending to a legendary brotherhood. But as the smoke from the ceremonial cannons cleared, a profound, lingering paradox remained. Did Fidel spend 30 years hunting for Che's bones out of pure, unadulterated loyalty, or was it the ultimate political masterstroke to permanently institutionalize a martyr whose living presence would have torn his regime apart? Che died fighting a hopeless war in the jungle, while Fidel died an old man in a palace, proving that in the cold theater of history, the idealist pays with his life, while the politician inherits the earth.